The so-called natural ceiling every major influencer and doctor talks about is a myth. It doesn't exist. In this video, I will try to explain to you why this ceiling doesn't exist. I will talk about recovery from resistance training, fatigue, volume recovery, overreaching and overtraining, and steroids. Yes, steroids. Yes, this video is long, but to properly understand recovery, I can't just talk about it in 10 minutes. By the way, this is the part 1 of recovery. The second part will talk about how to maximize recovery. So, what is recovery? Simply put, recovery is the process of returning to a normal state after a stressful event, physical damage, or any physical harm. In our case, it's returning to a normal state after a hard resistance training session with the aim of overcompensating to see muscle growth. Here, when I will talk about muscle growth, I will also include strength. 3 major variables influence recovery: proximity to failure, training volume, and exercise selection. In general, recovery demands increase when training involves more sets or total volume, training closer to or at failure, exercises producing greater eccentric loading, exercises performed at a longer muscle lengths, and exercises involving more muscle mass, particularly lower body compound exercises. Training to failure generally produces greater acute fatigue than stopping before failure. Failure training can increase recovery time, produce larger temporary performance decreases, increase perceived fatigue, and slow recovery of neuromuscular function. Several studies found that failure was particularly problematic when sets involves many repetitions, when large muscle groups were trained, and when the same muscles exercises were trained again soon afterward. Training to failure does not appear necessary to maximize strength or hypertrophy based on recent meta-analysis. Therefore, failure can be useful, but its fatigue cost needs to be considered. I would have agreed if they had a broad range of combinations. Every major study tries at least 3 sets with whatever number of reps. 3 sets taken to failure, yeah, that's a bad idea. But 1 or 2 sets, that's another story. I couldn't find a study that compared 2 sets against 3 sets taken to failure. I just remember it from a video I watched a long time ago. A video who led me towards Mike Menser's way, by the way. But what I remember is that the 2 sets won against the 3 sets. So failure can't be bad if it's used properly. Like for example, for maximum of 2 sets per muscle group per day and maximum 12 reps. Higher training volume generally requires more recovery. A high volume session can cause larger performance reductions, greater muscle damage, greater muscle soreness, and longer recovery times. One study comparing high volume versus high intensity squat training found that the high volume condition produced greater performance deficits and muscle damage. This means that 2 sessions can have similar intensity, but very different recovery requirements depending on how much work is performed. The authors therefore recommend considering where the volume is placed within the week, rather than simply looking at weekly volume. Exercises differ considerably in their recovery demands. Exercises tend to require more recovery when they involve high eccentric torque, long muscle lengths, large amounts of muscle mass, and heavy loading. Lower body compound exercises can therefore be particularly demanding. Why? Well, because the legs have a ton of motor neurons, the neurons responsible for voluntary contractions like lifting weights. So, the nervous system is highly impacted. Are argued that the nervous system is more impacted than the muscular system, because the nervous system commands muscle contraction. We'll see this in a bit, but for now let's go back to exercise selection. The same number of sets does not necessarily mean the same recovery requirement. 3 sets of a demanding squat variation is not the same as 3 sets of a low fatigue isolation exercise. Recovery shouldn't be considered separately from how sessions are organized. The order of training sessions can influence how recovered you are for subsequent high priority sessions. For example, instead of hypertrophy, strength, power, it may sometimes be preferable to use hypertrophy, power, strength. The idea is that the power session can be less demanding in certain contexts, allowing more recovery before the important strength session. One study found that changing session order could allow athletes to perform more repetitions and volume in the subsequent high priority strength session. But do what is more important towards your goal. Let's say in an upper body training day, you have muscle ups, dips, pull-ups, biceps and triceps. If your goal is explosiveness then strength and only after hypertrophy, then the order should be muscle ups, dips, pull-ups, biceps and triceps. If your goal is strength then hypertrophy and only after power, then the order should be dips, pull-ups, biceps, triceps and muscle ups. So you choose the combination that fits your goal. If you don't have a particular goal, beginning with power exercises is the best, because they are highly demanding on the nervous system, so best to train them at the beginning of the workout. After the power, the best is strength and only after hypertrophy. Recovery should be considered when constructing the whole training week, not just after individual workouts. the goal isn't necessarily to minimize fatigue. Instead, the goal is to create enough fatigue to stimulus ratio to drive adaptation while ensuring that fatigue doesn't interfere with subsequent important training sessions. Now, let's talk about fatigue. When we talk about fatigue, we talk about central and peripheral fatigue. Resistance training produces both peripheral and central fatigue. Peripheral fatigue is fatigue occurring within the muscles and the neuromuscular system. Central fatigue is a reduction in the nervous system's ability to maintain motor drive to the muscles. Sadly for us, peripheral fatigue is much better understood than central fatigue, even though the central nervous system commands the peripheral nervous system. What happens inside the muscles during resistance training? ATP and phosphocreatine decrease, muscle glycogen decreases, inorganic phosphate increases, hydrogen ions increase, and lactate increases, particularly as exercise intensity and fast twitch fiber recruitment increase. These metabolic changes interfere with the muscle's ability to continue producing force. One of the particularly interesting findings over the years is the role of group 3 and 4 muscle afferents. Group 3 and 4 muscle afferents are thin sensory nerve fibers in skeletal muscles. Group 3 fibers are thinly myelinated and respond mostly to mechanical stretch or pressure. Group 4 fibers are unmyelinated and respond mostly to chemical and metabolic changes like lactic acid or low oxygen during contraction. These sensory nerves detect things such as mechanical stress, metabolic changes, ATP, inorganic phosphate, hydrogen ions, and other chemical changes associated with hard muscular contractions. They send information from the muscle toward the nervous system. This creates a feedback loop. Hard muscular contraction creates metabolic and mechanical disturbances, which leads to group 3-4 afferent activation. They send signals to the CNS, resulting in an alteration of motor drive. So fatigue isn't simply the muscle running out of energy. The brain is also receiving information about the state of the muscle and can modify how much neural drive is sent to it. During intense exercise, the CNS can reduce the neural drive sent to the working muscles. This means that the muscle can theoretically be capable of producing more force, but the nervous system is limiting its maximal force production. This mechanism may serve as a protective function by limiting excess fatigue, metabolic disturbances, and potentially tissue damage. What happens during exercises performed at or near over 1 rep max? Both type 1 and type 2 motor units are recruited. Type 2 fibers experience substantial metabolic stress during very intense exercise. ATP depletion and inorganic phosphate accumulation can become substantial and lactate production increases as type 2 fiber recruitment increases. These metabolic disturbances can stimulate group 3-4 afferents. Consequently, very intense resistance exercise can produce both substantial local muscular fatigue and potentially significant neural fatigue. Of course, going to failure isn't bad if you do a maximum of 2 sets. Everything in the gym is a matter of equilibrium, so just make sure that you don't overdo it. We can connect fatigue to recovery. Resistance training deliberately creates a physiological disturbance. Adaptation occurs during the subsequent recovery period. If recovery is insufficient, residual fatigue can remain when the next training session begins. Repeatedly accumulating fatigue without adequate recovery can eventually impair performance and adaptation. In extreme cases, chronic excessive training can contribute to overreaching or overtraining. Remember, the purpose of recovery isn't simply eliminating soreness, but is to restore the systems that allow you to produce high-quality training sessions again. One study tested the quadriceps recovery after 3 types of exercises: jump, sprints, and strength training. For strength, they did 10 sets of 5 reps back squats at 80% of their 1 rep max. For jumps, they did 10 sets of 5 jump squats. And for sprints, they did 15 sets of 30 seconds maximal sprints. Fatigue did not completely disappear within 24 hours. By 72 hours, the neuromuscular and perceptual fatigue measures had generally returned to baseline. Jump training recovered somewhat faster. Jump fatigue essentially recovered by 48 hours. Strength and sprint fatigue persisted up to 72 hours. 72 hours! It means if you did 10 sets of 5 reps at 80% of your 1 rep max on Monday, then you can only train again on Wednesday. The potentiated quadriceps twitch force was reduced after all 3 training sessions. This measure reflects the muscle's ability to produce force when directly stimulated. Therefore, it provides an indication of peripheral muscular fatigue, rather than simply reduced motivation or voluntary effort. Twitch force remained significantly depressed for approximately 48 hours after strength training, jump training, and sprint training. The strength training session produced the largest immediate reduction in twitch force. However, the subsequent recovery trajectory was similar between the 3 training conditions. This indicates that heavy resistance training produced particularly substantial acute muscular fatigue, but the muscle generally followed a similar recovery pattern afterward. Voluntary activation was also reduced. This indicates that part of the post-exercise force loss came from an impaired ability of the nervous system to fully activate the muscle. Recovery differed between protocols. For jump and sprints, voluntary activation was reduced for approximately 24 hours. And for strength, voluntary activation was reduced for approximately 48 hours. The researchers' main conclusion was that repeated maximal effort training can produce neuromuscular fatigue lasting as long as 72 hours. This applied to heavy resistance training, jump training, and sprint training. This is important because these training sessions are organized with the assumption that 48 hours of recovery is okay. The study suggests that 48 hours may not always be enough for complete recovery, particularly after important strength or sprint sessions. One of the most important points of that paper I read this from is that it challenges the common assumption that heavy training causes prolonged CNS fatigue. There was some reduction in voluntary activation, approximately 24 hours after jumping and sprinting sessions, and approximately 48 hours after resistance training sessions. However, other measures of CNS function did not show significant impairment. The persistent reduction in quadriceps twitch force suggests that peripheral factors were a major contributor to the fatigue. The fact that twitch force remained depressed for 48 hours across all three protocols was particularly important evidence for this interpretation. The strength protocol produced the largest immediate reduction in peripheral muscle function. This makes sense given the protocol. 50 total back squat repetitions at 80% of the 1 rep max, with every repetition performed with maximal intent. Despite being only 80% of their 1 rep max, the combination of high load, high volume, maximum effort created substantial fatigue. This is particularly relevant to resistance training programming because the fatigue generated by a session depends on more than simply the percentage of your 1 rep max. An important implication is that the participants didn't simply perform just a few sets. The strength session consisted of 50 repetitions performed at 80% of their 1 rep max. This is absolute madness for one muscle group, and still so many people do it daily. Like every study, it has its issues. The study investigated very demanding maximal effort protocols. It does not establish that every resistance workout requires a 72-hour recovery, or every muscle needs 72 hours before training it again, or that training a muscle before 72 hours prevents hypertrophy, or that you cannot train upper body while your lower body is recovering. The participants were also only 10 male athletes, so the results shouldn't be generalized too broadly. But still, we have to take into account this important point. CNS was affected up to 48 hours after an intense strength training. So now, my fellow Arnold Schwarzenegger fans, do you think that going to the gym 5 times a week, doing a minimum of 20 sets every day is good for a recovery? Well, if you say yes, you are delusional. The only reason it works on certain people and bodybuilders is because they are on the juice. We will see it at the end of this video, but your natural ceiling is a myth. It doesn't exist. It only exists on certain people because they have accumulated too much fatigue over the years. You'll understand it soon enough, but Mike Mentzer was right and Arnold Schwarzenegger was wrong. So what could be the best amount of volume? We will divide this volume section into 4 parts: maintenance volume, minimum effective volume, maximum adaptive volume, and maximum recoverable volume. Here you have an image of all of them for every major muscle group by Dr. Mike Israetel. Everybody knows him, he's a famous bodybuilder and someone who studies everything there is to know about muscle growth, strength, and sports. I really respect his work, even though I find it wrong and damaging for lifters, and I'll tell you why. When he states that the minimum effective volume is, for the majority of muscle groups, at a minimum of 6 or 8, and that the maximum adaptive volume sits at 12, 16, 18 or even 20, I can only arrive to the conclusion that he is suggesting a low intensity training. Because if you do high intensity, you will fry your nervous system. I'll tell the story one more time. A year and a half ago, I did everything that was on this image. I followed every major doctor, every expert, and no results. Then I reduced volume, like Mike Mentzer said decades ago, and I saw progress, I saw results, finally. So, start with 4 sets per muscle group per week for 1 month, and then the next month, if you feel that you could have better results, do 1 more set, to failure of course. Compare the progress and only do what brings you the best results possible. And like I said in my last video, failure will make sure that you worked harder than last time to see continual progress. So start with 4 sets per muscle group per week. Of course, beginner lifters can grow from anything because they can't lift heavy enough to damage their nervous system, but as you grow stronger and bigger, the load increases and so the strain on your nervous system. This is when you either reduce the number of sets or you give yourself one more resting day. But we will talk about this in a later video. Keep in mind that everybody is different and not everybody can recover from 10 sets per week. Start low and go up progressively. And mostly don't blindly listen to every expert or doctor. Try for yourself every possibility. Remember that the ultimate goal of recovery is to overcompensate and to lift more and heavier the next time. So don't think that by giving more work to your muscle, you will get stronger. You won't. You will only get stronger once you recover. There are three concepts that people overlook when they talk about recovery, and they are functional overreaching, non-functional overreaching, and overtraining syndrome. Well, overtraining is discussed a lot, but overreaching is not. First, functional overreaching. Short periods of deliberately increased training volume and/or intensity can produce functional overreaching. This usually involves a temporary decrease in performance during the overload period, followed by recovery. Then performance improvement, overcompensation, after the recovery or taper period. This appears to be particularly relevant in strength sports because athletes deliberately use overload periods before competitions. Several studies used approximately 1 to 4 weeks of increased training, followed by the reduced training, tapering, and observed subsequent improvements in strength or sport-specific performance. Some evidence suggests that there may be a dose-response relationship. Greater short-term increases in training can potentially produce greater subsequent adaptations, although this does not mean that more training is always better. A temporary performance decrease does not automatically mean overtraining. In the context of planned functional overreaching, the decrease in performance is actually part of the process and can be followed by improved performance after recovery. Now, non-functional overreaching. This is where the evidence becomes more concerning. One review found evidence that chronic high volume and/or high intensity resistance training can produce non-functional overreaching. Non-functional overreaching involves two things. 1. Performance remaining depressed for weeks to months. 2. Recovery eventually occurring, but without the expected overcompensation. We are getting closer to what doctors and influencers call the natural ceiling. Some studies involving very demanding resistance training protocols produced decreased strength, decreased power, decreased neuromuscular performance, and increased markers of muscle damage. Importantly, however, some performance reductions recovered relatively quickly after training stopped or was reduced, meaning that they were more consistent with functional overreaching or short-term fatigue rather than true overtraining syndrome. The main problem isn't simply doing a hard training block. The problem is accumulating too much training fatigue that you can actually recover from it over a long period of time. The authors of one study specifically described non-functional overreaching as a lack of recovery over a long period of time. Now, as we continue, we begin to understand that everything is linked to recovery, so your natural ceiling could literally mean poor recovery over an extended period of time. But we need more material for this, so let's keep going. Finally, overtraining. Overall, there was little evidence of true overtraining syndrome simply because there are too many people who don't agree on the definition of overtraining. Some people state that overtraining is observed after a few weeks, some agree months, others talk about years. Overtraining does occur, but to specifically identify one case is extremely hard. A lot of people, me included, have misused the term overtraining. What we meant was non-functional overreaching. For it to be truly overtraining syndrome, there needs to be no recovery at all and only muscle damage, which could literally be deadly for the body. To properly assess someone's condition, a lot of tests need to be done. For example, only doing isometric strength or 1 rep max strength tests is not enough. There needs to be a bunch of tests like weightlifting performance, jump and sprint performance, power test, so on and so forth. One athlete may show decreased sprint or jump performance while maintaining or even improving 1 rep max strength. Therefore, relying on one performance test may give an incomplete picture of fatigue. Hormonal testing is also useful, but not reliable enough. The reason is simple. Hormonal responses vary depending on the training experience, volume, intensity, and many individual characteristics. Hormones can show that the athlete is experiencing a physical response to training, but they cannot reliably tell you whether someone has progressed from functional overreaching to non-functional overreaching. The study had its issues like always. First and foremost, the review does not establish that overreaching is beneficial for hypertrophy, nor does it establish exactly how non-functional overreaching or overtraining syndrome affects hypertrophy. There was little evidence supporting this, but some studies even reported increases in lean mass or muscle size during periodized programs containing an overtraining syndrome phase. One review also raises an important issue concerning training to muscular failure. Some literature suggests that chronic exposure to failure could increase the risk of non-functional overreaching, overtraining syndrome, or overuse injuries. However, the authors identified this as an area requiring much more research rather than drawing a definitive conclusion. In other words, the paper I read this information from does not conclude that training to failure automatically causes overtraining. The study couldn't really identify the transition between functional overreaching and non-functional overreaching. It's way harder than expected, but the authors collectively agree on one pattern: training stress, fatigue, recovery, and adaptation. To better understand how someone could reach their natural ceiling, we need to do a deep dive into the nervous system. Neural strength refers to how effectively the nervous system recruits and coordinates muscle fibers to produce force. Two people with similar muscle size can have different strength because the nervous system may differ in how effectively they activate their muscles. Early strength gains from resistance training are largely attributed to neural adaptations before substantial muscle growth occurs. The nervous system activates motor units, which consist of a motor neuron and the muscle fibers it controls. Greater motor unit recruitment also allows greater force production. There is a process in all of this: brain, motor neuron, neuromuscular junction, acetylcholine release, muscle fiber contraction. Stronger and faster neural signaling allows more of the muscle's force production capacity to be accessed. In the body, Golgi tendon organs work as a sensory receptors that detect muscle and tendon tension. When tension becomes very high, signals from the GTOs can contribute to inhibition of motor neuron activity. This is a protective mechanism that can limit force production. Different rep ranges give different results. 1 to 5 reps, so more than 80% of your run rep max, come with high neural demand, high motor unit recruitment, and greater emphasis on rate coding. It's particularly useful for maximal strength. 6 to 12 reps, so between 65 and 80% of your run rep max, come with the combination of neural adaptations and hypertrophy. This develops both strength and muscle size. Well. Guess who was right again? And 12 plus reps, so less than 65% of your run rep max, come with a greater emphasis on muscular endurance and energy systems. The source I read this from describes this neural demand as relatively lower. When we work out, neural adaptations occur. Increased motor unit recruitment, improved synchronization, coordination of muscle activation, reduced neural inhibition, and improved efficiency of neuromuscular transmission. These adaptations help explain why substantial strength increases can occur before noticeable changes in muscle size. Gradually increased training demands is presented as necessary for continued neural adaptation. We talked about progressive overload in the last video, so if you don't know what it is, I recommend you go and check it out. But without progressive overload, both muscular and neural adaptations can eventually plateau. Repeatedly performing very high training without sufficient recovery can lead to CNS fatigue. Signs include lower bar speed, when you do squat for example, poor coordination, sleep disruption, and mental fatigue or burnout. On the other hand, exclusively training with light loads may provide insufficient exposure to the demands of maximal strength production. This is why periodization techniques are efficient. We will talk about periodization in another video because this one is already too long. Some training methods are good for neural strength: heavy compound exercises, explosive exercises, skill practice, and adequate recovery. Neural recovery is important when training for maximal strength. Rest days, deloads, and adequate sleep are necessary for continued progression. Sources state that heavy maximal lifting may require approximately 48 to 72 hours for full neural recovery, although recovery varies according to training intensity, the muscle group worked, and individual factors. So guess who was right once again? I can't make this up, I literally cannot make this up, I'm just reading what the studies state. And now the very last subject of this video, steroids. We will talk about anabolic androgenic steroids because they are the ones that are useful for this study and they are the ones used by bodybuilders, for example. We will simply call them steroids for this video. And so how do they work? Well, most anabolic androgenic steroids are lipid soluble. Because of this, they can pass through the cell membrane of muscle cells. Once inside, they interact with the androgen receptor. Normally, testosterone circulates in the blood and can enter cells. Inside the cell, the steroid binds to the androgen receptor. This changes the receptor's shape, and the activated receptor can then move into the cell nucleus. This is important because the nucleus contains the cell's DNA. Inside the nucleus, the activated androgen receptor can bind to specific regions of DNA called androgen response elements. This changes the transcription of particular genes. Some of the proteins produced as a result contribute to processes involved in muscle growth, tissue maintenance, and adaptation. One of the major consequences is an increase in muscle cells' ability to maintain and accumulate contractile proteins. Your muscle fibers contain proteins such as myosin, actin, troponin, and tropomyosin. These proteins are fundamental to muscle contraction. When the balance between muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown becomes more favorable toward the synthesis, muscle protein can accumulate. Steroids can strongly influence this balance. Skeletal muscle contains satellite cells, which are muscle stem and progenitor cells. Steroids can influence satellite cell activity and their contribution to muscle tissue. This is particularly interesting for hypertrophy because satellite cells can become activated following muscle stress, proliferate, differentiate, and contribute additional myonuclei to muscle fibers. More myonuclei can potentially support a greater capacity for gene transcription and protein production within a muscle fiber. This is one reason the effects of steroids go simply beyond increasing protein synthesis for a few hours after the workout. Steroids can also be transformed via some enzymes, but this is not the topic of this video. Steroids can influence several things simultaneously: muscle hypertrophy, muscle protein synthesis, muscle fiber size, muscle recovery and adaptation, red blood cell production, connective tissue, and neuromuscular performance. The increased muscle mass itself can obviously increase force-producing capacity, while other physiological changes can contribute to performance as well. For example, some steroids stimulate erythropoiesis, red blood cell production, which can increase oxygen carrying capacity. All of this theory means that someone who is on steroids can benefit from more volume, more intensity, and less recovery. Of course, there are a ton of bad side effects, but this is not the topic of this video. So, to make it short, anabolic androgenic steroids increase the production of protein synthesis and reduce recovery time by blocking the effects of cortisol, the stress hormone, which means catabolism of muscle is reduced. Catabolism is, as Wikipedia states, the set of metabolic pathways that breaks down molecules into smaller units that are either oxidized to release energy or used in other anabolic reactions. Now you begin to understand that what truly separates a natural lifter and a non-natural lifter is, simply put, recovery. Okay then, why isn't there a ceiling stopping non-natural lifters? Well, because thanks to steroids, they can recover every single time after a workout, so they cannot hit a ceiling. It's not really true because even on steroids, you can hit a ceiling. So what it means for us is this: if we truly optimize our training workout and optimize recovery, we can never see a natural ceiling. Well, we will have less progress than the non-natural lifters, but we will never hit a ceiling. We just need to give ourselves enough rest. So at least one full day of recovery between workouts. If we fatigue the peripheral nervous system, it's just muscle fatigue, which means other muscles aren't affected. But if we fatigue the central nervous system, we fatigue the whole body, since it's the commander of everything. And since it can take up to 48 to 72 hours for the CNS to properly recover, you cannot go to the gym one day after the other. In addition, you cannot train hard and for a long period of time. Since the most important factor of muscle growth is training harder than last time, failure will make sure that you worked harder than last time because you gave 100% of what you got. So if you train to failure, no more than 4 sets per muscle group per week. Well, you can always adapt, but if you see that your progress is slowing down, you can always do less sets or give yourself one more recovery day. Now, you probably think that I'm delusional, or maybe you are thanking me for opening your eyes on this subject. But one thing is certain: if you don't try for yourself, you cannot tell me that I'm wrong, because I personally see results with Mike Mentzer's way. The bottom line is this: no, the natural ceiling does not exist if you recover well. No, not every influencer or doctor is right. And finally, yes, Mike Mentzer was right, and Arnold Schwarzenegger was wrong all along. In my opinion, even non-natural lifters can benefit from high-intensity, low-volume, like natural lifters. Well, they can always adapt, like I said, to give themselves a little bit more sets. This they can do. So here I won't talk about how to properly recover because it will take me more than 20 minutes. So this is why the next video will talk about this. But yeah, ladies and gentlemen, that was everything I had to say. If you enjoyed, let me know it in the comments. If you want to give me your opinion on this subject, please feel free to do it, but keep an open mind. Let's not start insulting each other and just be cool and have normal conversations. And we will meet next time for the second part of recovery. And like always, take care.